My parents didn't want children at the Christmas party, including my son, but when I arrived at their house, I saw my sister's 3 kids running around. I asked calmly, "So the rule was just for me?" My mother laughed. "You know how he acts." I whispered, "And you'll see how I act too." What I did next left everyone speechless, especially my father, who stood up and yelled, "You went too far." But it was only the beginning. Christmas has always been a complicated time for me. People talk about the holidays like they're supposed to be magical, filled with warmth, family, and love. But for me, Christmas was always a delicate balancing act, one where I tried to hold on to the illusion that my parents cared about me and my son as much as they did about my sister and her family. This year, though, that illusion shattered. It started with a text in the family group chat. "Mom, Christmas Eve dinner at our house. 6 p.m. Dress nice. And no kids this year, adults only. We want a peaceful night for once. Hope everyone can make it. Red heart." I stared at my screen, my stomach twisting. No kids? That wasn't normal for us. Every Christmas Eve, my sister Amelia brought her 3 kids, Chase, 9, Ava, 7, and Dylan, 5. And of course, I always brought Aiden. He was 6 now, old enough to understand traditions, to look forward to seeing his grandparents, to feel the sting of being left out. I typed out a response carefully. "Me? Wait, so no kids at all?" Mom replied almost instantly. "Mom, right. We just want to enjoy an evening without chaos. It's just one night." One night. I should have known right then. I should have seen it coming. But I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Me. "Okay, I'll see if I can find a sitter for Aiden." No reply. Just a thumbs-up reaction to my message. That was it. I should have pressed harder. I should have asked why they were suddenly changing the rules. But instead, I pushed down the unease and told Aiden he'd be having a fun night with Aunt Jenna. If I had known what was waiting for me at my parents' house, I would have never gone at all. I arrived at 6:15, running late because I had spent too long trying to convince Aiden that staying with Jenna would be fun. He had pouted, saying, "But I want to go to Grandma's too." And my heart cracked a little. I hated lying to him, but what could I say? That his grandparents just didn't want him there? As I pulled up to the house, I saw Amelia's car parked out front. I didn't think much of it. Maybe she had just stopped by to say hello before going wherever she was actually spending Christmas Eve. But the moment I walked inside, I heard them. Children. Laughing, yelling, running. I stepped into the living room, and my stomach dropped. Chase and Dylan were wrestling on the carpet, knocking into the coffee table. Ava was sitting on the couch, swinging her legs, clutching a stuffed animal. Their voices filled the house, high-pitched and excitable, blending into the clinking of glasses and the hum of Christmas music. I froze in the doorway, gripping the doorknob so hard my knuckles turned white. My mother walked in from the kitchen, holding a tray of wine glasses. She looked up, saw me standing there, and smiled. "Oh, sweetheart. Come in, come in. We just opened the wine." I didn't move. My throat was dry. "I thought you said no kids." Her smile barely faltered. She glanced toward the living room like she had forgotten there were 3 children running wild in her house. "Oh, well, Amelia couldn't find a babysitter. And you know how much the kids love coming here." I inhaled slowly. My ears started to ring. "So," I said carefully, "the rule was just for me?" Mom let out a light laugh, like I was being ridiculous. "You know how Aiden acts." That was it. That was all she said. Like it was nothing. Like it was casual. Like it wasn't the most disgusting thing a grandmother could say about her own grandson. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. Amelia was sitting at the dining table, swirling a glass of red wine, pretending she wasn't listening. My father was in his recliner, flipping through a newspaper, ignoring me entirely. I took a step closer to my mother and whispered, just for her to hear, "And you'll see how I act too." She blinked, but before she could respond, I turned on my heel and walked straight back out the door. I heard her call after me, but I didn't stop. I wasn't going home, and I wasn't going to sit in my car crying either. No. I was going to show them exactly how I act when you mess with my son. I pulled out my phone and called Jenna. "Hey," she answered. "What's up?" "Change of plans," I said, my voice steady cold. "Bring Aiden to my parents' house." There was a pause. "Wait," I thought, "just bring him." Jenna didn't question me. She knew me well enough to hear the steel in my voice. 20 minutes later, her car pulled up beside mine. Aiden hopped out, bundled in his little red sweater with snowflakes on it, his tiny hands stuffed into his coat pockets. "Mommy." He looked up at me, confused. I thought I was staying with Aunt Jenna. I crouched down and cupped his cheek. "I changed my mind, baby. We're going to Grandma's. And you can do whatever you want." His face lit up. "Really? Really?" I took his hand and marched back inside. The second we stepped into the house, silence fell like a heavy curtain. My mother turned, saw Aiden, and paled. Amelia's eyes widened. My father slowly lowered his newspaper, his expression darkening. I felt the weight of every single pair of eyes in that room. But I didn't care. Aiden spotted the other kids and ran toward them, his little sneakers thudding against the hardwood. He dove straight into their game, his laughter mingling with theirs. Mom took a step toward me, her voice tight. I told you no kids. I smiled, sharp as glass. No, you told me no kids. But apparently, that rule only applied to my son. So if they get to stay, so does he. Tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Amelia shifted uncomfortably, swirling her wine. Dad finally stood, his face red with anger. You went too far. I turned my gaze to him, unblinking. No, you went too far when you decided my son wasn't good enough for this family. Silence. Ava giggled. Chase and Dylan kept playing. Aiden, blissfully unaware, was already pulling out his toy cars. I turned toward the door. You wanted a peaceful night? Then I'll give you one. Mom stiffened. What does that mean? I met her gaze, my voice calm. It means this is the last Christmas you'll ever spend with me and my son. And with that, I walked out, leaving them with nothing but their own silence. The silence followed me all the way to my car. I could still feel their stares burning into my back as I helped Aiden into his car seat. My heart was pounding, my fingers trembling slightly as I buckled him in. But I kept my face calm, steady. Mommy, are we leaving already? Aiden asked, blinking up at me. I forced a small smile. Not yet, baby. We're just taking a little break. I shut the car door and took a deep breath, my chest tight with anger. My whole body was buzzing, a mix of adrenaline and rage. I turned back toward the house, half expecting my mother to come rushing out after me, demanding an apology or telling me to stop being so dramatic. But the door stayed shut. I should have just driven away. I should have taken Aiden home and called it a night. But something in me, something deep and unresolved, wouldn't let me leave it like this. I wasn't done. I checked on Aiden through the window. He was already fiddling with a toy Jenna had given him, then turned on my heel and walked back inside. The second I stepped through the door, I saw my father standing by the fireplace, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Amelia was still at the dining table, her wine glass now empty, her face unreadable. And my mother? She was in the kitchen, gripping the counter so hard her knuckles were white. She looked up at me as I walked in, and for a brief second, I saw something in her eyes. Not guilt, not regret, annoyance. Like I was the problem, like I was ruining her night. I let the door slam shut behind me. So that's it. My voice was quiet, but sharp. You're really just going to stand here and act like nothing happened? Dad scoffed. What exactly do you want from us? I laughed under my breath, shaking my head. Oh, I don't know. Maybe an explanation? Maybe the truth. My eyes locked onto my mother's. Why was Aiden the only one not welcome here? Mom let out a long breath, like she was tired of this conversation before it had even started. We just wanted one night, she said, her voice carefully measured, without the extra noise and energy. I gestured toward the living room, where Chase and Dylan were still fighting on the floor, knocking into furniture. But this is fine. She had the audacity to give me a look. Aiden's different. The words hit me like a slap. Different how? My voice was shaking now, but not from sadness. From fury. Mom hesitated, glancing at Amelia, but Amelia stayed silent, her fingers tracing the rim of her empty wine glass. Finally, Mom sighed and looked back at me. You know how he is, she said vaguely. Say it, I demanded. He's a lot to handle sometimes, she finally admitted. He gets too excited, too emotional. He doesn't know when to calm down. I felt something in me snap. So what? That makes him less than Amelia's kids. Mom sighed again, rubbing her temples like I was the one giving her a headache. Sweetheart, you always take things so personally. I let out a short, bitter laugh. Personally? You just told me my son, the only grandchild you have from me, is too much for you. How the HLL am I supposed to take that? Dad finally spoke up, his voice sharp. You're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be. I turned to him, my hands shaking at my sides. No, you made this a big deal when you decided Aiden wasn't good enough for you. That's not what we said, Mom snapped. It's exactly what you meant. There was a heavy silence. I turned to Amelia, my last hope for someone, anyone, to speak up. But she just shrugged. Mom and Dad's house, their rules. Something inside me went cold. I stared at her, really looked at her, and saw what I should have seen years ago. She was comfortable in this dynamic. She was used to being the favorite, the golden child, the one whose kids could do no wrong. And me? I was just the extra, the one they tolerated but never truly embraced. I took a step back, exhaling slowly. Wow, I whispered. I finally see it. See what? Mom asked, exasperated. I met her eyes. That I was never really part of this family. Her expression flickered, just for a second, but it was there. That tiny flash of recognition. Like deep down, she knew I was right. But instead of apologizing, instead of owning it, she just crossed her arms and looked away. I swallowed hard, then turned toward the door. I hope you enjoy your peaceful Christmas, I said quietly. Because I won't be part of it ever again. And this time, I meant it. I stepped back into the hallway, the cold bite of the night air still lingering in my veins, even though I was indoors now. I could feel every heartbeat as if it were amplified by the silence that had settled over the room. My footsteps echoed softly on the hardwood floor as I moved to the window, peering out into the dark street while the sound of the ongoing conversation drifted from behind me. Inside, tension had become a living presence. I heard my mother's muffled sigh and the clink of something being set down on a table. In the living room, my father's heavy footsteps signaled that he was pacing, his frustration palpable even through the walls. Amelia's subdued murmurs hinted at some internal conflict, though she refused to look directly at me. For a long, agonizing minute, it was as if the house itself was holding its breath. I caught a glimpse of Aiden through the window, a small silhouette in the front yard, playing quietly with a stray toy, his innocent face illuminated by the soft glow of a street lamp. My heart ached for him. It was as if every sound in the house was a reminder of the injustice he'd been forced to endure simply because he was different. Unable to bear the silence any longer, I walked back to the center of the room. I could see my father now, his expression conflicted between anger and something that might have been regret, but he said nothing. Instead, his eyes kept darting back to the closed door behind me, as if he was expecting it to swing open and reveal something more, something I wasn't willing to give him. "Is this really what you want?" my father finally asked, his voice rough with emotion. The question wasn't a demand for explanation. It was almost a plea, a hope for some reconciliation that might mend the fractured night. I stopped, my gaze locking with his. "You know exactly what I want," I replied, my voice steady but filled with a deep sadness that I couldn't quite hide. "I want my son to be treated with the same respect, the same love that you've always given to others. I want my child to be welcome, not shunned because he's different." My father's face tightened. It wasn't about him being different. It was about, he started, then hesitated, as if the right words were caught somewhere between his heart and his pride. "And you'll never say the words?" I challenged softly. "If you can't say it out loud, then it's just a convenient excuse to keep the status quo. I won't let my son suffer the consequences of your selective affection." The conversation had taken a turn neither of us could reverse. My mother joined in then, her voice quiet and resigned. "I never meant for it to hurt you. I thought it would be just one night, one moment of peace. I never imagined it would break everything open like this." There was an edge to her tone that suggested she was both apologetic and defensive, a duality that left me reeling. I could see in her eyes a spark of remorse, but it was quickly masked by the shield of indifference that had become so familiar over the years. "Mom, if you cared about me or Aiden even a little bit, you'd have tried harder to understand him, instead of hiding behind tired old excuses," I said, feeling each word lash out like a whip. "I'm tired of living in a house where I have to justify every part of who I am. I'm tired of being the outlier in a family that should be unconditional." The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them away as if trying to erase the emotion before it took root. Amelia, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke in a low tone that carried a weight of regret and resignation. "We never wanted it to be like this," she murmured, almost inaudible over the rustling of the wind outside. I took a deep breath, feeling the exhaustion of years of pent-up frustration and sorrow mingle with the adrenaline of tonight's confrontation. "Maybe none of us did," I whispered. "But tonight, you made it clear that nothing will ever change unless someone has the courage to stand up." At that moment, the room seemed to crackle with unresolved tension, each of us standing on the edge of a precipice, teetering between regret and the possibility of something more honest, something raw. I knew the conversation was far from over, and I was acutely aware that every word, every silent pause, was leading us further down a path with no easy way back. I stepped away from the group and moved toward the kitchen, where the clamor of cutlery and distant voices reminded me that this was still a family dinner, a Christmas Eve meant to be celebrated. Yet everything had changed in a matter of minutes. I could sense that the old dynamics were shifting, that the foundations of our relationships were cracking under the weight of unspoken truths. From behind me, I heard my father call softly, "Maybe we should talk, all of us together." His tone held a hint of vulnerability, a rare softness that made me pause. I turned slowly, meeting his gaze once more. His eyes, usually so cold and controlled, now brimmed with something I couldn't quite decipher. Regret, perhaps, or fear of losing us all to this unyielding divide. "Talk is good," I replied, "but it has to be honest. And right now, honesty is something we're all struggling with." I glanced around at the room, a room filled with memories, expectations, and the weight of every Christmas that had ever been celebrated here. "I'm not leaving until we do that." My mother reached out, her hand trembling as she rested it on my shoulder, a gesture that I wasn't sure whether to accept or reject. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Let's try to understand each other, even if it hurts." I looked down at her hand, then up at her face. The warmth in her eyes was faint, buried under years of conditioned behavior and quiet disappointments. "I want to understand," I said slowly, "but But I also need you to understand. Aiden is not a burden. He's not an inconvenience. He's my heart. And if you can't accept him, then what does that say about the love you have for me? The question hung in the air, heavier than any accusation. It was a turning point, a moment where every unspoken word, every hidden resentment, demanded to be acknowledged. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes as if echoing the turmoil within. I could feel the night pressing in, the dark sky reflecting the uncertain future of a family on the brink. I knew that this was not the end of our confrontation. The raw honesty of that moment, the difficult admissions and the painful silences, were only the beginning of a conversation that needed to be had, a conversation that might lead to healing or further fracture us beyond repair. And as I stood there, caught between the past and a future I wasn't sure I wanted to step into, I realized that the only way forward was through the truth, no matter how bitter it might taste. There was still so much left unsaid, so many wounds that had yet to be acknowledged. And as I prepared myself to dive deeper into this heart-wrenching dialogue, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again, at least, not without the raw, unfiltered honesty that was now laying bare the soul of our fractured family. The air in the room was thick, heavy with something unspoken, something that had been festering beneath the surface for years. My mother's hand was still on my shoulder, hesitant, as if she was testing whether I'd shake her off or let her in. I didn't move. I couldn't. Not yet. I glanced at my father, whose lips were pressed into a thin line, his jaw tight with whatever emotion he was trying to suppress. My sister, Amelia, was still sitting at the dining table, her empty wine glass spinning slowly between her fingers. Her husband, Josh, who had stayed quiet through the entire confrontation, was now staring at the floor, clearly uncomfortable. I took a breath, measured and controlled, even though everything inside of me was unraveling. "You want to talk?" I asked, my voice quieter now, but no less sharp. "Fine, let's talk." Mom let out a shaky breath, nodding. "Okay." I turned, crossing my arms. "But let's talk about the real issue, not just the easy parts. Because I don't think this is just about Christmas or one night without kids. I think this is about something bigger. Something you've never had the guts to admit." Mom's eyes flickered. "That's not fair." I cut her off, my voice finally breaking. "Fair? You want to talk about fair? Then tell me, what exactly is fair about Aiden being singled out? What's fair about him having to ask me why he wasn't invited to a house that's supposed to feel like home?" Dad let out a low sigh and pinched the bridge of his nose like he was already exhausted. "You're making this bigger than it is." "No, you're making it smaller than it is," I shot back. "You always do. That's the problem." He scoffed, but didn't argue. I turned my focus back to my mother. "Go ahead. Say it. Say what you really meant when you said Aiden is different. Say it out loud so we can all hear you." Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment, I hoped, she'd actually say it. But instead, she just shook her head. "I didn't mean it the way you're taking it." I laughed under my breath, bitter and hollow. "Right? Because how dare I take it exactly the way you meant it?" Mom's shoulders slumped slightly. "He's just high energy, sweetheart. You know that. He's always moving, always asking a million questions. Always." She hesitated, then sighed. "He's a handful." There it was. I should have expected it, but hearing it out loud still sent a sharp sting through my chest. "He's 6, I said through gritted teeth. "He's supposed to be curious. He's supposed to have energy. That's what kids do." Mom exhaled. "Amelia's kids don't," I warned, my voice suddenly shaking. "Do not compare him to them." Her lips pressed together. But Amelia, sitting at the table, finally decided to chime in. "You do have to admit he's a lot," she said, swirling her empty wine glass in slow circles. Her voice was casual, like we were talking about an overactive puppy and not my actual child. "I mean, Chase and Ava have always known when to calm down, but Aiden, he just keeps going and going. And sometimes it is overwhelming." My blood ran hot. "Oh, I'm so sorry my child doesn't fit into your perfect little mold of what a kid should be," I snapped. "I'm sorry he actually has emotions, instead of being a miniature adult like you want your kids to be." Amelia rolled her eyes. "Oh my God, you're being dramatic." "No," I said, stepping toward her now. "I'm being a mother who refuses to let her son grow up thinking he's a problem." Dad let out a groan, rubbing his temples. "No one said he was a problem." I turned on him, my hands shaking. "Then tell me, why wasn't he invited? Why were Amelia's kids running around here, laughing, playing, being exactly as loud as Aiden would have been, but he was the one excluded?" Dad looked at me, then at my mother. "Because," Mom cut in before he could answer. "Because we didn't want the chaos tonight. We just wanted one quiet night." I shook my head. "No, you wanted one night without him. Without us. Be honest for once." Mom hesitated, and for the briefest moment, something flickered in her eyes. Regret? Guilt? But instead of admitting it, she deflected. "We love Aiden." "No, you tolerate Aiden," I corrected. "You love Amelia's kids. You make space for them. You make excuses for them. But my son? He's too much. He's the one you make rules against. You don't love him, Mom. You endure him. I saw the way her throat bobbed, the way she blinked hard, like she was trying to keep from showing emotion. And I felt a deep, guttural pain in my chest because I realized something in that moment. She knew I was right. She knew it, and she hated it. Maybe we just don't know how to handle him, she admitted finally, her voice softer now. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. That's the best excuse you've got? That's the reason you pushed him out? Because you don't know how to handle him. Dad shifted in his seat. It's not that simple. It is that simple, I shot back. It's exactly that simple. Because if it were Chase or Ava or Dylan, if they were a little too hyper, a little too emotional, a little too much, you'd have patience for them. You'd work with them. But when it's Aiden, you'd rather just keep him away. No one spoke. Amelia looked uncomfortable, glancing toward her husband, who was still staring at the floor like he wanted to be anywhere but here. My father looked at my mother, waiting for her to say something, anything, that might fix this. But she didn't. She just looked at me, her expression unreadable. I felt my throat tighten. I get it now, I whispered. I always thought I was just imagining it. That I was just being sensitive, that I was overreacting. But I'm not. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. You don't love my son the way you love Amelia's kids. And if I'm being honest, I don't think you've ever really loved me the way you love her, either. Mom's lips parted slightly, like she wanted to protest. But she didn't. She couldn't. Because we both knew the truth now. And the truth was irreversible. Irreparable. Unforgivable. The room had never felt colder. A heavy silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. No one spoke. No one could speak. Because now the truth was out. And truth has a way of settling into the air, making it impossible to ignore. I looked at my mother, searching her face for something. Remorse, guilt, anything that would tell me she actually cared. But she just stood there, wringing her hands, eyes flicking to my father like he was the one who could fix this. Amelia? She was looking down at her empty wine glass like it held all the answers. Dad. He just exhaled loudly, shaking his head. And that's when I realized they weren't going to fight for me. They weren't going to argue. They weren't going to beg me to stay. They weren't going to fix this. Because in their minds, I was the problem. Not them. Not their favoritism. Not their blatant rejection of my son. Just me, for daring to bring it up. For refusing to let it slide. For demanding that my son be treated as an equal. I felt something inside me shift, something final. And that's when I knew I was done here. But I wasn't just going to walk away quietly. No, I was going to show them exactly what it felt like to be left behind. I turned on my heel and walked toward the front door, not sparing them another glance. I yanked it open and stepped outside, the cold December air hitting me like a slap. Aiden was still sitting in the car, humming to himself as he played with his toy car, completely oblivious to the emotional war zone I had just walked out of. I walked up to the car, opened the door, and crouched down beside him. Hey, buddy, I said softly. He looked up at me, his big, innocent eyes full of curiosity. Mommy, are we going back inside? I smiled. A real smile, one filled with love, not the tight, forced one I had been giving my family all night. No, baby, we're not going back inside. But I have an idea. Do you want to have our own Christmas party? His face lit up. Just us, I confirmed. And Aunt Jenna, if she wants to come. We'll get cookies, hot chocolate, open presents early, stay up late. Whatever you want. His grin stretched, so wide I thought his cheeks might burst. That sounds so fun. I kissed his forehead, then stood up and pulled out my phone. I dialed Jenna's number, and she picked up on the second ring. Hey, she said. Everything okay? Everything is perfect, I said. Change of plans. I'm throwing my own Christmas party, and you're invited. She laughed. Oh, did your parents finally pull the sticks out of their asses? I smirked. Nope. I just finally decided I don't have to keep waiting for them to. Jenna was quiet for a second. Then, softly, she said, good for you. Yeah, I murmured. Good for me. I hung up and turned back to Aiden. You ready, buddy? He nodded enthusiastically, and I helped him buckle in. Then, before getting in the car myself, I did something I knew my parents would never forget. I pulled out my phone, snapped a picture of their house, the house I had spent years trying to feel at home in, and I sent it to the family group chat, along with a message, Merry Christmas. Hope Amelia's kids fill the space my son and I left behind. Then I blocked the chat. Every single one of them. Mom, Dad, Amelia, gone. I slid into the driver's seat, turned the key in the ignition, and pulled away from the curb. As I drove, I glanced at Aiden in the rearview mirror, his little face glowing with excitement, completely unaware that his mother had just made the most important decision of her life. Because tonight, I wasn't just choosing to leave my family behind. I was choosing us. I was choosing me. And the best part? I didn't feel a single ounce of regret. That was my revenge. Walking away and knowing, without a doubt, that I would never, ever look back.